General Grant survived the cannons, but fell to a cigar. After 20 a day, his throat is now a massive, rotting tumor. Bankrupt and starving, he is on a suicide mission, writing memoirs to save his wife. Fueled by cocaine to numb the agony, he wraps a scarf tight to hide the stench of his own decay. This is the 12-month hell of a dying hero. The tragedy began 5 years earlier in Gilded Age, New York. By 1880, the city was dominated by ruthless capital and men like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller. Grant had just returned from a world tour, dining with kings and queens as the most famous man on earth. But in New York, fame did not pay the bills. Grant faced a cold reality. He was a retired president with no pension. He needed money to maintain his station. But his greatest strength in war became his fatal flaw in business: pathological trust. Grant was incapable of lying, so he assumed others were too. On the battlefield, the enemy was clearly marked in gray uniforms, but on Wall Street, predators wore the same silk suits as their victims. Grant walked into the financial district, believing a handshake still meant something. It was a miscalculation that would cost him everything. By 1883, Grant believed he had secured his family's dynasty. He had invested his entire life savings, every penny earned from the war, every gift from grateful citizens, every dollar from the sale of his previous homes, into an investment firm founded by his son Buck and a charismatic young partner named Ferdinand Ward. Life was good. The checks were coming in regularly, and the returns were astronomical. Grant bought a brownstone on East 66th Street and filled it with the memorabilia of his conquests. He sat in his parlor smoking his cigars, believing he had finally mastered the art of peace, just as he had mastered the art of war. He told his friends he was worth millions. He believed he was a financial genius. He didn't know that he was actually the victim of one of the greatest swindles in American history. He didn't know that every cigar he smoked was bringing the tumor closer to the surface. The hero was comfortable, blind, and unsuspecting. The trap was ready to snap shut. Far from the battlefield, the catastrophe unfolded inside the plush, velvet-draped parlors of Gilded Age Wall Street. If the Civil War was a contest of iron and blood, the financial world of the 1880s was a theater of smoke and mirrors. And the undisputed ringmaster of this circus was a man named Ferdinand Ward. To the public, Ward was a prodigy, a financial messiah dubbed the young Napoleon of finance. He was barely 30 years old, possessing the kind of kinetic energy that made the air in a room vibrate. He was small, sharp-featured, and possessed a smile that could disarm the most cynical banker in Manhattan. But beneath the well-tailored suits and the boyish charm lay a conscience that was not just flexible, but non-existent. Ward was a sociopath of the highest order. He did not see human beings. He saw assets to be leveraged and liabilities to be liquidated. Ward's genius lay in his understanding of the American psyche. He knew that in a chaotic, rapidly industrializing nation, people crave stability. They craved a symbol of unimpeachable integrity, and there was no symbol more potent than the name Grant. Ward didn't just want a business partner. He wanted a figurehead, a golden idol he could place in the lobby to blind investors. He began his campaign not by attacking the general directly, but by courting his son, Ulysses Buck Grant Jr. Through Buck, Ward spun a web of potential riches, eventually drawing the old general into his orbit. In 1880, the partnership of Grant and Ward was formed. On paper, it was the perfect marriage. Ward provided the financial wizardry, and Grant provided the reputation. The mechanics of the fraud were breathtaking in their simplicity and audacity. Ward operated what we would today recognize as a classic Ponzi scheme, decades before Charles Ponzi gave the crime his name. But Ward added a unique twist: the government contract lie. He would whisper to prospective investors, men with old money and deep pockets, that the firm had exclusive secret access to lucrative government contracts. He implied with a wink and a nod that because General Grant was a partner, the firm could secure contracts to supply the Army with hay, oats, and uniforms at inflated prices. "We can't put this on paper," Ward would say, lowering his voice, "because of the general's position. But the returns are guaranteed." It was a lie so bold that no one dared question it. There were no contracts, there was no hay, there were no uniforms. There was only money flowing in from new investors, which Ward used to pay extravagant dividends to the early ones. He created a closed loop of fictional prosperity. Grant, for his part, was kept in a state of blissful, carefully cultivated ignorance. He was the silent partner, the loss leader of the operation. He would come into the office, sit at his desk, smoke his cigar, and sign papers that Ward placed in front of him. He never looked at the ledger. He never audited the accounts. Why would he? In Grant's world, the world of the officer corps, a man's word was his bond. If Ward said they were making money, they were making money. Grant projected his own monumental integrity onto a man who had none. For 3 years, the illusion was absolute. Grant believed he was worth millions. He urged everyone he loved to invest in the firm. His son Buck put in his entire inheritance. His nephews, his in-laws, his war buddies, they all poured their life savings into Grant and Ward, believing that if the old man was involved, their money was safer than in the U.S. Treasury. Grant bought a mansion on East 66th Street. He lived the life of a victorious patriarch, surrounded by children and grandchildren, believing he had finally secured the Grant dynasty for generations to come. He did not know that he was living inside a soap bubble that was drifting toward a needle. The needle arrived on a quiet Sunday, May 4th, 1884. History remembers this as the day the Black Sunday crisis began. Ferdinand Ward arrived at Grant's home in the morning. He looked disheveled, frantic, a master class in acting. He told the general that the Marine National Bank, where their firm deposited its funds, was in temporary trouble due to a cash flow hiccup. It was a minor issue, Ward assured him, but they needed immediate liquidity. They needed $150,000 to tide the bank over for a single day, just 24 hours. "If we don't cover this," Ward said, eyes wide with manufactured panic, "the firm might face embarrassment." Embarrassment. That was the trigger word. For a man like Grant, whose honor was his lifeblood, the threat of financial embarrassment was intolerable. He had no cash on hand. His wealth was all tied up in the firm, so he did the only thing a soldier could do. He went to reinforce the line. Despite his bad leg, despite the Sunday heat, Grant took a carriage to the mansion of William Henry Vanderbilt, the richest man in America. The meeting between Grant and Vanderbilt is one of the most tragic scenes in American financial history. Grant limped into the parlor, hat in hand, a former president asking for a loan. Vanderbilt, a man who famously said the public be damned, was no fool. He looked at the old hero, saw the desperation in his eyes, and knew something was wrong. When Grant explained he needed the money for the firm of Grant and Ward, Vanderbilt reportedly shook his head. "General," he said, his voice cold but respectful, "I would not lend a penny to your partner, Ferdinand Ward, for I know him to be a rascal and a thief. But to you, to the Savior of the Union, I will lend anything you ask." Vanderbilt sat down and wrote a personal check for $150,000. He handed it to Grant. It was an act of immense personal respect, a tribute from the king of capital to the king of war. Grant took the check, his heart swelling with gratitude, believing he had saved the day. He rushed back and handed the check directly to Ferdinand Ward. He did not know it, but he had just thrown his lifeline into an incinerator. Ward took the money, cashed it immediately, and pocketed it. It didn't go to the bank. It went into Ward's escape fund. Monday passed in a strange, ominous silence. Then came Tuesday morning, May 6th. Grant rose early, dressed in his finest suit, and took the carriage to Wall Street. As he approached the financial district, the air felt different. There was a static charge of panic in the streets. Men were running. Newsboys were shouting indecipherable headlines. As the carriage pulled up to the offices of Grant and Ward, the general saw the unthinkable. A mob, a literal mob of angry, shouting men was banging on the locked doors of his firm. Grant, confused, pushed his way through the crowd. Men stepped back when they saw him, their faces a mixture of fury and pity. He unlocked the door and went upstairs. The offices were empty. Papers were strewn across the floor. The clerks were gone, and Ferdinand Ward was gone. Grant walked to his desk and sat down. A grim-faced clerk from the Marine National Bank entered and delivered the news that would shatter Grant's world forever. "The bank has failed, General. The firm has failed. Mr. Ward has absconded." Grant sat there, stone-faced. He asked to see the books. For the first time in 3 years, the ledger was opened. It took only minutes to see the truth. The assets column was empty. The liabilities were astronomical. The millions were a fiction. The government contracts were a fairy tale. The firm wasn't just bankrupt. It was a black hole of debt. The realization hit Grant with the force of a physical blow, harder than any he had taken at Vicksburg. He wasn't just broke. He was personally responsible for the ruin of his entire family. The $150,000 he had borrowed from Vanderbilt was gone, swallowed in hours. He had pledged his word, and now his word was worthless. He had dragged his son, his friends, and strangers into the abyss with him. The unsinkable general sat in the silence of the empty office, the roar of the angry crowd outside growing louder, vibrating through the window glass. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it. His hands, usually so steady holding the reins of a horse, trembled slightly. He counted the bills. $80. That was it. That was the sum total of the fortune of Ulysses S. Grant. $80 to support a wife, children, and grandchildren. $80 to pay off millions in debt. He had entered the office that morning believing he was a titan of industry. He would leave it a pauper, a fool, and a man who had lost the one thing he valued more than life, his good name. He closed the wallet, stood up on his aching legs, and prepared to walk out of the door into the gauntlet of the people he had unwittingly destroyed. The financial execution was complete. Now, the physical execution could begin. The carriage ride back to East 66th Street on that Tuesday afternoon was the longest journey of Ulysses S. Grant's life. It was longer than the march to Vicksburg, longer than the road to Appomattox. He sat in the dark interior of the cab, his bad leg throbbing in rhythm with the carriage wheels, clutching his wallet with the $80 inside. It was a terrifying sum. $80 to feed a household that included his wife, his children, and his servants. $80 to face a world that believed him to be a millionaire. When he stepped through the front door of his brownstone, the silence of the house hit him like a physical weight. He had to do the hardest thing a man of his era could imagine. He had to look his wife, Julia, in the eye and tell her that he had lost everything. Not just their savings, but her security, her future, and the very roof over her head. Julia Grant was a woman of immense strength, but the news brought her to her knees. The fall was absolute. They were not just poor in the genteel sense, they were destitute. But for Grant, the poverty was secondary to the honor. The debt to William Henry Vanderbilt, that $150,000 personal loan, hung over him like a guillotine blade. In the Victorian code of honor that Grant lived by, a debt of honor was a sacred blood oath. He could not sleep, he could not eat, knowing that he had taken money from Vanderbilt under false pretenses, even if he had been the one deceived. He told his lawyer, "I will not let Mr. Vanderbilt lose a single dime, even if I have to sell the shirt off my back." And so began the great stripping. To repay the loan, the Grants had to liquidate their lives. It was a fire sale of history. Grant and Julia signed over the deeds to their Manhattan home. They signed over their summer cottage in Long Branch. They signed over a property in Philadelphia. But the real estate wasn't enough to cover the massive hole Ferdinand Ward had dug. Vanderbilt, to his credit, tried to refuse the assets. He told Grant that the debt could be forgiven, that the country owed him more than money. But Grant was adamant. His pride was the only thing he had left, and he would not mortgage it. He insisted on paying in full. When the real estate was gone and the debt still remained, Grant went to the final reserve. He went upstairs to his study and opened the cabinets that held the physical proof of his glory. He began to pack up his war treasures. These were not just objects. They were the holy relics of the Union. He took down the gold medal voted to him by Congress after Vicksburg. He took down the diamond-hilted sword presented to him by the citizens of New York. He took down the shoulder straps he had worn when Lee surrendered. In a scene of profound humiliation, the old general, hands shaking not from age but from shame, wrapped these holy relics of the Union in brown paper and twine. He was trading his legacy for debt relief. He crated them up and had them shipped to Vanderbilt's house as collateral. It was a humiliation so profound that it is difficult to quantify. The savior of the Union was effectively pawning his own heroism to pay for a con man's crimes. Vanderbilt accepted them only to save Grant's dignity, eventually donating them to the Smithsonian because he couldn't bear to own the stripped honors of a national hero. By the summer of 1884, the Grant household had entered a state of grim siege. The illusion of wealth had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of subsistence. They had no income, none. The famous general, the two-term president, did not have the cash to pay the butcher or the grocer. The servants, loyal to the end, stayed on without pay, but loyalty doesn't buy bread. The humiliation seeped into the smallest cracks of their daily life. One afternoon, a stranger, a man from the West who had served under Grant, heard rumors of the general's distress. He mailed a check for $500 to the house. When Grant opened the envelope, he wept. He didn't weep from relief. He wept from the sheer crushing embarrassment of charity. He, who had commanded the treasury of the United States, was now living on handouts from strangers. He tried to return the money, but the cupboard was bare. He had to keep it. He had to swallow the bitter pill of gratitude just to keep the lights on. Grant sank into a profound depression. He stopped walking. He stopped talking. He would sit for hours on his porch staring at the ocean during their last days at Long Branch, a cigar clamped firmly in his jaw, silent as a stone. He was punishing himself. He replayed every conversation with Ferdinand Ward, every signature, every moment of blindness. The stress was eating him alive. His immune system, battered by years of war and now pulverized by shame, began to collapse. It is no coincidence that in this exact moment of psychological nadir, The body began to revolt. The stress of the bankruptcy created the perfect storm for the dormant monster in his throat to awaken. He smoked more furiously than ever, using the tobacco as a sedative, a way to numb the shame that was burning a hole in his stomach. He didn't know it yet, but the penniless general was about to face a creditor far more ruthless than William Vanderbilt. He had lost his money. He had lost his home. He had lost his pride. And now, in the silence of his despair, he was about to lose his voice. The final bill was coming due, and this time, he couldn't pay it with swords or medals. This time, the payment would be flesh and blood. The physical collapse began with a moment so mundane, it seems almost insulting to history. It was the summer of 1884, just weeks after the financial ruin. Grant was at his summer cottage in Long Branch, New Jersey, trying to escape the suffocating heat and the shame of New York City. He sat on his porch, staring at the ocean, and picked up a peach. He took a bite. As the juice hit the back of his throat, Grant flinched violently. A sharp, searing pain, like the stab of a bayonet, shot through the base of his tongue. He dropped the fruit. He turned to his wife, Julia, his eyes watering, and whispered a sentence that signaled the beginning of the end. Water hurts like swallowing fire. He dismissed it at first. A sore throat, a cold. But the pain did not leave. It settled in, a dull, throbbing ache that spiked into agony every time he swallowed. Grant was a stoic man. He had endured the freezing mud of the wilderness and the slaughter of Cold Harbor without complaint. But this was different. This was an enemy that didn't attack from the front lines. It was an insurgency growing inside his own body. The enemy had entered his body through a celebrated weapon. For 20 years, Ulysses S. Grant had been the most famous smoker in the world. During the Civil War, a reporter had written a story about Grant smoking a cigar during the victory at Fort Donelson. The public loved the image of the cool, detached general with a cigar clamped in his jaw. In a burst of patriotic fervor, people from all over the Union sent him cigars, thousands of them. At one point, it is estimated that over 10,000 boxes of premium tobacco arrived at his headquarters. Grant, dealing with the crushing stress of commanding 1 million men, smoked them all. He smoked up to 20 strong black cigars a day. He chewed on them when they weren't lit. The cigar became part of his face, a permanent fixture. He had inhaled the adoration of the nation, and with it, he had inhaled a slow, creeping death. By October 1884, back in the gloom of his Manhattan brownstone, the pain was no longer ignorable. Grant's neck had begun to swell on the outside. Eating became a torture session. Finally, at the urging of his family, he visited Dr. John Douglas, the leading cancer specialist in New York. The examination room was stark, smelling of carbolic acid and dread. There were no x-rays, no biopsies, as we know them. Dr. Douglas used a simple laryngeal mirror to reflect sunlight into the dark cavern of the general's throat. Grant opened his mouth. The doctor peered in. What he saw made his blood run cold. At the root of the tongue, spreading aggressively to the soft palate and the tonsils, was a jagged, ulcerated growth the size of a walnut. It was angry, red, and hard as stone. In the medical terminology of 1884, it was called an epithelioma, squamous cell carcinoma. Today we call it throat cancer. But in 1884, this was not a diagnosis. It was a death warrant. The location of the tumor was catastrophic. It was wrapped around the intricate network of arteries and nerves in the neck. Surgery was impossible. To cut it out would be to slash the carotid artery, and the general would bleed to death on the table in seconds. Dr. Douglas put down the mirror. He looked at the former president. There was no way to soften the blow, not to a man like Grant. He told him the truth. It was cancer, it was aggressive, and it was terminal. Grant received the news with the same terrifying calm he had shown when Lee surrendered. He didn't blink. He didn't cry out. He simply asked, "Is it curable?" When the doctor hesitated, Grant nodded. He knew the answer. The old soldier recognized a mortal wound when he felt one. He walked out of the office and back into the bustling streets of New York, carrying a secret that was heavier than any artillery shell. He was broke. He was humiliated. And now he was dying. The convergence of tragedies was absolute. Grant realized with a jolt of horror that he was about to leave Julia not just a widow, but a destitute widow. The $80 in his wallet was not enough to bury him, let alone support her. He had no pension. He had no savings. He had nothing but a rotting throat and a pile of debts. The clock had started ticking. He had months, maybe weeks, before the tumor strangled him or the cancer starved him to death. He needed a miracle. He needed a way to turn his tragedy into currency, and he needed it fast. In the winter of 1884, with the diagnosis of cancer secret but the reality of bankruptcy, public, the vultures began to circle. The prestigious Century magazine, the titan of American publishing, saw an opportunity. They knew Grant was desperate. They knew he had no income. So they approached the dying hero with a proposition that was nothing short of predatory. They offered him a standard contract to write his memoirs, a paltry $500 per article, or a book deal with a royalty rate of 10%. To a modern ear, 10% might sound standard, but in 1884, for a figure of Grant's magnitude, it was insulting. It was robbery. The editors at Century calculated that Grant, humiliated and starving, would take whatever crumbs they threw at him. They expected him to be grateful. They drafted the papers, confident that they were about to acquire the most valuable literary property in America for the price of a used carriage. Grant, beaten down by life and believing he had no other choice, was ready to sign. He sat at his desk, pen hovering over the contract that would sell his life story for pennies on the dollar. Then the doorbell rang. Enter Samuel Clemens, known to the world as Mark Twain. If Grant was the silent, stoic rock of America, Twain was its loud, untamed river. With his wild white hair, bushy mustache, and inevitable white suit, Twain was a force of nature. He was a friend of Grant's, but more than that, he was a worshiper of the man who saved the Union. When Twain heard rumors of the Century deal, he didn't just get angry. He became incandescent with rage. He rushed to Grant's brownstone on East 66th Street, marched into the study, and demanded to see the contract. Grant handed it to him. Twain read it, his eyes narrowing. He looked up at the general and told him in no uncertain terms that the people at Century were thieves. "General," Twain reportedly said, "you are about to make a present of your memoirs to these people. This is not a contract. It is a crime." Grant looked at him, his face gaunt, his voice already raspy from the tumor. "I have no choice, Sam," he said. "I have no money. I have to leave something for Julia." Twain slammed his hand on the desk. He told Grant to tear up the contract. He made a counter-proposal that stunned the room. Twain had his own publishing house, Charles L. Webster and Company. He looked the general in the eye and said, "I will publish your book, and I won't give you 10%. I will pay you 75% of the net profits." The room went silent. In the publishing world, 75% was unheard of. It was financial suicide for a publisher. It was a number so high it defied the laws of capitalism. Grant, ever the skeptic now after the war disaster, asked Twain if he was sure. He asked if such a thing was even possible. Twain didn't blink. He knew something the Century editors didn't. He knew that the American people loved Grant. He knew that if the book was sold correctly, not in bookstores, but door to door by an army of veterans, it would sell millions. "General," Twain said, "this book will support your wife for the rest of her life, but you have to write it." It was a gamble of titanic proportions. Twain was betting his own fortune on the stamina of a dying man. If Grant died before the book was finished, Twain would lose everything he invested. If Grant finished it, they would both make history. Grant looked at the contract Twain sketched out. For the first time in months, the fog of despair lifted. He saw a path. He saw a way to redeem himself. He saw a way to turn his death into a victory. He picked up his pen, not to sign his surrender to Century, but to sign an alliance with Mark Twain. The deal was struck. The advance money was paid immediately, a check for $1,000, followed swiftly by more, enough to keep the grocery bills paid and the lights on. The relief in the Grant household was palpable. But with the relief came a terrifying pressure. The clock was now ticking louder than ever. Grant had the money, but now he had to deliver the words. He had to condense the most complex war in American history into 2 volumes of prose, all while a tumor the size of a walnut was slowly closing his throat. The race had begun. It was Ulysses S. Grant versus the Reaper, with Mark Twain holding the stopwatch. With the contract signed and the advance money in the bank, the Grant household transformed. It was no longer a home, it was a command post. The enemy was time, the weapon was memory, and the fuel was cocaine. By late 1884, the tumor in Grant's throat had grown large enough to make swallowing solid food agonizing. The simple act of drinking water felt like swallowing shards of glass. The pain was constant, a dull, throbbing bass line to his life that occasionally spiked into a scream. To allow the general to think, let alone write, Dr. Douglas had to resort to the heavy artillery of 19th century medicine. The treatment regimen was brutal and effective. Twice a day, sometimes more, Dr. Douglas would arrive with a small vial of clear liquid, a 4% solution of cocaine hydrochloride. In 1885, cocaine was not an illegal narcotic. It was a miracle anesthetic, the newest wonder drug of the age. The doctor would take a camel hair brush, dip it into the solution, and reach deep into Grant's throat to paint the ulcerated tumor directly. The sensation was immediate. The cocaine numbed the exposed nerves upon contact. For a few precious hours, the fire in his throat was extinguished, but the drug did more than just kill the pain. It was a potent stimulant. As the cocaine entered his bloodstream through the mucous membranes, Grant's eyes would widen. The glazed look of the dying man would vanish, replaced by a terrifying, electric intensity. His heart rate would climb. The fog of exhaustion would lift. He was high, chemically, undeniably high, but focused. When the pain broke through the cocaine blockade, or when the coughing fits became too violent to bear, the doctors brought out the needle, morphine. They injected it directly into his arm. So for the last year of his life, Ulysses S. Grant existed in a state of suspended animation, balanced precariously on a speedball of cocaine and morphine. The effect on his writing was profound. Under the influence of the stimulants, Grant's mind didn't just function, it time traveled. He told Mark Twain that his memory had suddenly become photographic. He could see the battlefield of Shiloh as if he were hovering above it in a balloon. He could recall the exact topography of Vicksburg, the smell of the mud, the sound of the mule teams, the precise wording of orders he had given 20 years ago. The drug stripped away the filters of age and trauma, leaving behind a raw, high-definition feed of his past. He wrote like a man possessed. He would sit at his desk wrapped in blankets, his hand flying across the page. He didn't write with the flowery, poetic style of the era. He wrote with the punchy, direct syntax of a soldier issuing orders. Subject, verb, object. The prose was lean, muscular, and relentless. He was racing. He knew that every time the cocaine wore off, the pain would return with a vengeance and the writing would stop. So he crammed as many words as he could into the windows of relief. But there was a cost. The stimulants kept his brain firing, but his body was crumbling. The lack of sleep was catastrophic. The cocaine made him feel invincible for 2 hours, but left him shattered for the next 4. He became irritable, snapping at Julia or the servants, something the gentle general had never done. He was burning the candle at both ends, and then tossing the candle into a furnace. He was trading hours of his life for pages of his book. It was a Faustian bargain, but Grant made it willingly. He wasn't writing for fame anymore. He was writing for bread. He was writing so that when he was gone, Julia wouldn't have to beg. As the pages piled up, hundreds of them, written in a scrawl that grew shakier by the week, the tumor continued its inexorable march. It began to press against his windpipe. It began to invade the soft tissue of his neck. The cocaine could hide the pain, but it couldn't stop the growth. The machine was running at full speed, but the chassis was falling apart. By the early spring of 1885, the battlefield had shrunk. It was no longer the vast continent of North America, nor the bustling streets of Manhattan, nor even the study where he wrote. The world of Ulysses S. Grant had contracted to the dimensions of a single piece of furniture, a large tufted leather armchair. The tumor, that epithelioma gnawing at the root of his tongue, was not merely a source of pain, it was a physical blockade. It had grown large enough to encroach upon the windpipe, acting like a slowly tightening garrote. This created a terrifying physiological reality. Grant could no longer lie down. If he attempted to lie flat in a bed, the swollen heavy tissues of his throat would collapse backward, sealing off his airway completely. He would begin to suffocate within seconds, waking up in a panic, gasping for air like a drowning man. So the bed was abandoned. For the last 6 months of his life, the former president of the United States did not sleep in a bed. He lived, worked, and attempted to sleep solely in that chair, propped up by a fortress of pillows to keep his head vertical. Imagine the sheer physical exhaustion. Sleep became a series of terrified micro-naps. He would doze off, his chin would drop to his chest, the airway would pinch shut, and he would jerk awake, choking. This cycle repeated itself 10, 20, 30 times a night. It was a form of torture that would break a lesser man. The insomnia wasn't a lack of sleep. It was the biological impossibility of rest. His eyes, rimmed with red, grew sunken and dark. He existed in a twilight state of perpetual fatigue, where the line between the nightmare of his illness and the reality of the room began to blur. As the weeks dragged on, the lack of circulation from sitting upright 24 hours a day began to destroy the rest of his body. Gravity became an enemy. The blood pooled in his lower extremities. His legs and feet began to swell, a condition known as edema. The swelling was grotesque. His feet puffed up until they looked like dough, the skin stretching tight and shiny, weeping fluid. He had to wear oversized knitted wool slippers because no leather boot could contain his feet. These were the legs that had gripped the sides of war horses for 4 years. These were the legs that had walked the ramparts of Vicksburg. Now they were useless, heavy logs that anchored him to the chair. Every time he tried to shift his weight to relieve the pressure sores forming on his back, the fluid in his legs would shift, causing a deep, throbbing ache that radiated up his spine. He was becoming a statue of pain, calcifying in his own living room. But the edema and the insomnia were merely the prelude to the true horror. The most devastating aspect of the disease was not what it felt like, but what it smelled like. Cancer in the 19th century was a filthy business. There were no sterile environments, no advanced antibiotics to manage secondary infections. The tumor in Grant's throat was not just a lump of rogue cells. It was a living, dying organism. As the cancer grew, parts of the tumor would outgrow their blood supply and die. Necrosis set in. The tissue inside his mouth was rotting. The smell of necrosis is distinct. It is the sickly, sweet, cloying odor of decomposing meat. It is the smell of a battlefield 3 days after the fighting has stopped. And it was coming from the mouth of the most famous man in America. For a man like Grant, who was fastidious about his appearance and deeply dignified, this was a humiliation worse than bankruptcy. He became obsessed with the smell. He was terrified that his presence was repulsive to his family. This explains the scarf. Even indoors, even in the stifling heat of a room warmed by a coal fire, Grant would wrap a heavy wool scarf around his neck and pull it up over his chin. It wasn't just to hide the external swelling of the glands. It was a desperate attempt to filter the air, to trap the odor of his own decay inside his clothing so that Julia wouldn't have to smell it. This created a heartbreaking distance between the general and his beloved wife. Julia Grant was his rock. Their love story was one of the great romances of American history. She wanted to be near him, to hold him, to comfort him. But Grant began to pull away. He refused to kiss her. He would turn his face away when she leaned in, terrified that if she got too close, she would recoil in disgust. He denied himself the one comfort he craved, her touch, to protect her from the reality of his condition. He was isolating himself inside a fortress of stench and shame. The daily routine of the sick room was a grueling cycle of maintenance. Every few hours, the buildup of mucus, blood, and necrotic tissue in his throat would become unbearable. He would have to clear it. These were not polite coughs. They were violent, hacking convulsions that shook his entire frail frame. He would lean over the side of the chair, clutching the armrest until his knuckles turned white, retching and gagging as he tried to expel the blockage. By his side, always, was a porcelain spittoon. It was the altar of his suffering. He would spit out thick, ropey saliva streaked with bright red blood and black flecks of dead tissue. He would stare at it for a moment, wiping his mouth with a handkerchief that was immediately taken away to be boiled, breathless and trembling. And yet, in the midst of this visceral horror, the miracle continued. The moment the coughing fit passed, the moment he caught his breath, he would reach for his pen, he would signal for the pad of paper, he would demand the cocaine solution, and he would go back to Vicksburg. It is a testament to the sheer power of the human will that the prose produced in this chair by this rotting man was crystal clear. When you read the memoirs today, you do not smell the necrosis. You do not feel the edema. You do not hear the gasping for air. You hear only the calm, lucid voice of a commander surveying the field. He compartmentalized his dying body, locking the pain and the stench into a mental box so that his mind could be free to finish the job. He was decomposing and composing at the same time, a race between the rot and the ink. But the body has limits. By May 1885, the doctors knew they were losing. The tumor was spreading to the lymph nodes. The swelling in the neck was now visible from across the room, a hard, angry mass distorting the jawline. The scarf could no longer hide it. The smell could no longer be contained. The brownstone in New York, with its lack of ventilation and the oppressive city heat, was becoming a coffin. If Grant was to finish his book, he needed to escape the city. He needed air. He needed one final campground before the long night set in. By June of 1885, the brownstone on East 66th Street had ceased to be a home. It had become a fishbowl. The private agony of Ulysses S. Grant was being broadcast to the world in real time. Outside the front door, a battalion of reporters camped day and night. They sat on the stoops of neighboring houses, smoking cigarettes, playing cards, and waiting for the inevitable. They were the death watch. The atmosphere was macabre. Every time the front door opened, a dozen pencils would scratch against notepads. If Dr. Douglas looked grim, the evening editions would scream that the general was sinking. If a servant looked teary-eyed, the obituary writers would ready the printing plates. It was the first modern media spectacle of a celebrity death. They weren't just reporting the news, they were betting on it. There were pools among the journalists on the exact hour the general would take his last breath. The pressure on the family was suffocating. Grant, trapped inside his armchair, could feel the eyes of the world boring through the brick walls. He knew they were out there. He knew they were writing the final chapter of his life before he had even lived it. But the most immediate enemy was not the press. It was the heat. New York in June is a furnace. The humidity wrapped around the city like a wet wool blanket. For a man with a constricted airway, the heavy, stagnant air was torture. Every breath was a battle. The doctors realized that if Grant stayed in the city, he would suffocate within weeks. He needed altitude. He needed the thin, crisp air of the mountains. A wealthy friend, Joseph Drexel, offered his cottage on Mount McGregor, a resort area near Saratoga Springs, north of Albany. It was a lifeline. On June 16, 1885, the decision was made. The general would move. The departure from 66th Street was a scene of haunting pathos. At 8 a.m., the door opened. A hush fell over the crowd of reporters and the hundreds of onlookers who had gathered to pay their respects. They expected to see the hero of Appomattox. What they saw was a ghost. Ulysses S. Grant emerged, supported on either side by his doctors. He was a skeleton in a frock coat. His clothes hung off his frame as if they belonged to a larger man. He wore a silk top hat that seemed to balance precariously on his shrunken head. But the most shocking detail was the scarf. Even in the June heat, the heavy wool muffler was wound tight around his neck, hiding the monster that was eating him. He shuffled down the steps, his feet swollen in their knitted slippers, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. The crowd did not cheer. There were no huzzas. Men took off their hats. Women wept openly. It was a silence more thunderous than any cannonade Grant had ever heard. It was the sound of a nation saying goodbye. They transported him to Grand Central Depot in a private carriage. Vanderbilt had arranged for a special train, a rolling palace of velvet and mahogany, to take the dying man north. As the train chugged out of the station and began its journey up the Hudson River, Grant sat by the window. He could not speak. His voice was now just a wet, guttural rasp. But he watched the landscape roll by. Then came the moment that broke the hearts of everyone in the car. The train passed West Point, the military academy, the place where the farm boy from Ohio had learned the art of war, the cradle of the army. As the gray stone buildings of the academy came into view across the river, Grant leaned forward. His eyes, usually so dull from the morphine, sharpened. He stared at the parade grounds where he had marched as a cadet 40 years earlier. He stared at the cliffs where he had dreamed of glory. He raised a trembling hand to the brim of his hat in a silent, solitary salute. He wasn't just saluting his alma mater, he was saluting his past. He was saying goodbye to the lieutenant he used to be before the wars, before the presidency, before the betrayal, before the cancer. The train climbed higher into the Adirondack foothills. The air grew cooler. The humidity broke. When they arrived at Mount McGregor, the atmosphere was radically different. The Drexel Cottage was a large, airy Victorian house surrounded by pine trees. The scent of pine needles replaced the stench of horse manure and coal smoke. They carried Grant into the cottage and placed him in a large wicker chair on the wide wraparound porch. He took a deep breath. For the first time in months, the air didn't fight him. He looked out over the Hudson Valley, a sea of green stretching to the horizon. It was beautiful, it was peaceful, and it was the last place on earth he would ever see. But the death watch had followed him. The reporters set up camp in the nearby Hotel Balmoral. They established a telegraph line directly from the cottage to the newspaper offices in New York. The world was still watching. Every time Grant sat on the porch, powerful field glasses were trained on him from the hotel balcony. They watched him sip his water. They watched him adjust his scarf. They watched him write. This was the final stage. The actors were in place. The scenery was set. There was nowhere left to run. Grant settled into the wicker chair, pulled the blanket over his knees, and signaled for his writing pad. He had escaped the heat, but he hadn't escaped the deadline. The book wasn't finished, and the reaper was climbing the mountain. The silence on Mount McGregor was absolute. The pine trees whispered in the wind, and the birds sang in the valley below. But inside the Drexel Cottage, the most commanding voice of the 19th century had been extinguished. By late June 1885, the tumor had finally claimed its prize. Ulysses S. Grant could no longer speak. The voice that had ordered the assault on Fort Donelson, the voice that had dictated terms to Robert E. Lee, the voice that had taken the oath of office twice, was gone. It was reduced first to a jagged whisper, then to a wet gurgle, and finally to nothing. The cancer had invaded the vocal cords, turning communication into a torture. This silence birthed a new, heartbreaking artifact of history: the pencil pads. Denied the ability to speak, Grant kept a small stack of paper slips and a pencil in his breast pocket. For the last weeks of his life, every thought, every request, every expression of love or pain had to be written down. Imagine the frustration of a man whose mind was racing with the complex history of the Civil War, yet whose hand could only scribble a few words at a time. These notes, preserved to this day, are a window into his soul. Some are mundane, heartbreaking in their simplicity. I'm thirsty. The light hurts my eyes. Please move the pillow. Others are profound meditations on his own mortality. In one particularly haunting note, scrawled with a shaking hand, he wrote, "I think I am a verb instead of a personal pronoun. A verb is anything that signifies to be, to do, or to suffer. I signify all three." The suffering was indeed total, but so was the doing. The miracle of Mount McGregor was not that Grant was alive, it was that he was working. The medical reality was defying all logic. By all rights, Grant should have died in April. His body was a wreck. He was surviving on a diet of liquid beef tea and cocaine. His heart was weak, fluttering like a trapped bird. There were nights when the doctors, Dr. Douglas and Dr. Schrady, would stand over his chair, watches in hand, counting the seconds between breaths, convinced that this was the end. They would prepare the adrenaline. They would wake the family. And then Grant would open his eyes. It became a pattern, a grim routine of resurrection. He would sink into the coma of the dying, hovering on the precipice of the void, and then by sheer force of will, he would claw his way back. Why? Because the book wasn't finished. The narrative had not yet reached Appomattox. He could not die until Lee surrendered. He could not die until the Union was saved on paper. This was the silent battle. It was a war fought not with cannons, but with paragraphs. Grant was racing against his own physiology. He knew that the moment he stopped writing, the adrenaline would fade and the cancer would win. So he wrote with a desperation that was terrifying to behold. He sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets even on warm days, his hat pulled low, scribbling furiously. He was reliving the end of the war. He was describing the meeting at the McLean house. He was describing the dignity of Lee and the magnanimity of the Union terms. He was writing the closing arguments of his life. The physical act of writing became a superhuman feat. His hand was cramping constantly. His eyes were failing. The edema in his legs was so severe that his skin was weeping fluid. Yet the pencil moved. It moved with the same relentless, grinding momentum that had defined his military campaigns. He was flanking death. He was outmaneuvering the Reaper for one more day, one more hour, one more page. Mark Twain visited the cottage during these final days. He was struck dumb by what he saw. He later wrote that he had never seen a man fight so hard for so long. Twain realized that Grant wasn't just writing a book. He was performing a final act of service. He was sacrificing his last breaths to ensure his wife would never know poverty again. Finally, the day arrived. It was July 19th, 1885. The summer sun was high over the Adirondacks. Grant was weak, weaker than he had ever been. He signaled for his pad. He wrote a few final corrections. He reviewed the proofs for the second volume. He looked at the stack of manuscript pages, hundreds of thousands of words, written in agony, written in blood, written in the shadow of the grave. He placed the pencil down on the table. It rolled slightly and stopped. He looked at Dr. Douglas. He didn't write anything. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. It is done. The siege of Vicksburg had taken 47 days. The siege of Petersburg had taken 292 days. The siege of the Memoirs had taken 12 months. And Grant had won. He had finished the book. But with the victory came a sudden, terrifying shift. The moment the work was done, the invisible scaffolding that had held him up collapsed. The willpower that had kept his heart beating, that had forced his lungs to expand against the tumor, evaporated. The mission was accomplished. The soldier could finally stand down. Grant sank back into the wicker chair. The fierce light in his eyes dimmed. The unsinkable general had crossed his last river. He had secured the future. Now all that was left was to face the dark. The end did not come with the roar of cannons, nor with the chaos of a financial crash. It came with a quiet, terrifying simplicity. Once the manuscript was finished on July 19th, Ulysses S. Grant began to detach from the world. The adrenaline that had fueled his death watch evaporated. The sheer force of will that had kept his heart beating for the sake of his wife and his publisher was no longer necessary. The soldier had taken the hill. Now he could finally rest. For 3 days he drifted in and out of consciousness on the porch of the cottage, surrounded by the scent of pine and the murmurs of his family. He was no longer the general. He was just a father and a husband fading into the twilight. On the morning of July 23, 1885, at 8 a.m., the nurse noticed a change. Grant's breathing, which had been a labored, jagged rasp for months, suddenly became shallow and quiet. He opened his eyes one last time. He looked at the water glass on the table, then at his wife, Julia. He whispered a single, barely audible word. Water. It was the last order he would ever give. A few minutes later, surrounded by his weeping family, the chest of the old soldier heaved once, settled, and did not rise again. The doctors waited. They checked for a pulse that wasn't there. Dr. Douglas, the man who had painted the cocaine on the general's throat thousands of times, the man who had marched with him through the valley of the shadow of death, gently closed Grant's eyes. He walked to the porch railing and spoke to the reporters gathered below. "The general is dead." The telegraph wires hummed. Within minutes, the news flashed across the continent he had saved. Church bells began to toll in Saratoga, then in Albany, then in New York City, then in Chicago, and finally all the way to San Francisco. The nation stopped. For the first time since the assassination of Lincoln, the United States was united in grief. But the story of Ulysses S. Grant does not end with his death. In fact, his death was the catalyst for his final and perhaps greatest miracle. On August 8, 1885, New York City hosted the funeral. It was not just a ceremony, it was a seismic event. 1.5 million people, more than the entire population of the city at the time, lined the streets of Manhattan to watch the procession. It remains to this day one of the largest gatherings in American history. And in that procession, the world saw something impossible. Riding in the carriages, following the hearse, serving as pallbearers, were the Union generals, William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan. But sitting right next to them were the Confederate generals, Simon Bolivar Buckner and Joseph E. Johnston, men who had tried to kill each other 20 years earlier, men who had sent thousands of soldiers to their deaths in opposing uniforms, were now riding knee to knee, united by their respect for the man in the coffin. Grant's death did what his presidency had struggled to do. It healed the wound of the Civil War. In his dying, he forced the North and the South to mourn together. It was a final act of strategic genius, achieved from beyond the grave. But there was one more victory to be won, a victory that would be measured not in applause but in ink and paper. In February 1886, 6 months after the funeral, Mark Twain walked into the parlor of Julia Grant. He held in his hand a piece of paper that would vindicate every moment of agony Grant had endured in that wicker chair. It was a royalty check. The amount was staggering, $200,000. In today's money, that is roughly equivalent to $6 million. It was the largest single royalty check ever written in the history of publishing, up to that point, and it was just the first installment. In total, Julia Grant would receive nearly $450,000 from the sales of the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. Grant had done it. He had started the year with $80 in his pocket, a bankrupt laughingstock. He ended it as the author of the second best-selling book in America, behind only the Bible. He had not only saved his wife from poverty, he had made her a wealthy woman. He had restored his family's honor. He had turned his own slow, agonizing suicide into a legacy of gold. In his final campaign, Grant's naive honesty had led to ruin, and his vices had led to death. Yet, stripped of his uniform, his title, and his voice, he revealed the true core of his character. He showed the world that heroism isn't about charging up a hill with a saber. True heroism was sitting in a wicker chair, choking on blood, fighting through the morphine haze, and putting one word after another because he loved his wife more than he feared death. Ulysses S. Grant lived, suffered, and in his final year, conquered. The unsinkable general lost the battle with his body, but he won the war for his soul. As the sun sets on his tomb overlooking the river, the enduring image remains not of a president nor of a general, but of a dying man in a wool scarf holding a pencil and writing his way into immortality.